Good evening. I'm Francis Levy, co-director of the Philoctetes Center. I'm pleased to welcome you to tonight's roundtable, What is Imagination?, which marks the beginning of our inaugural weekend. Since the inception of this project, we've spent many wonderful evenings discussing everything from Coleridge and the workings of the child's mind to the impulses to collect, to form nations, to abstract, and to evaluate artworks. But amidst all the heady talk, and when we say heady in the context of the Philoctetes Center, we mean it literally, it is easy to forget that the discussion of the brain ultimately has to do with emotion. For instance, I'm the funder of the Philoctetes Center, but what made me start to write the checks? Those who know me will attest to the fact that I don't write checks all that easily, and I look in certain quarters over there. And what made me choose the name Philoctetes? Here are two everyday acts of imagination. The answer to why I did them is rather simple. First, imagination is the palette of psychoanalysis, and I'm a patient. So I was interested in imagination, and I was interested in applying psychoanalytic theory to art, another of my interests. Second, in the graduate program in drama in which I was enrolled, I had studied Sophocles' Philoctetes, which tells the story of the ostracized warrior with the noxious wound, who also holds the key to the Greeks' victory at Troy. I had then gone on to read Edmund Wilson's The Wound and the Bow, in which the myth was transposed into modern literature. Trauma and insight. None of the auspicious attendees at one of our early roundtables liked the idea, but I stuck with the name, another emotional rather than intellectual decision, though I do have to confess a certain degree of perplexity about why many artists reject the notion that pain motivates creativity. Obviously, I'm not out to disparage intellect. I just have to remind myself that it was emotion that got me here, and that my liking being around the group of artists and scientists who comprise our advisory board is not rational, however reasonable and intellectual the results may be. For instance, when Dr. Edward Nersessian, our co-director, introduced me to a psychoanalytic essay on imagination, which describes the process of mental representation that allows the child to separate from the mother by maintaining an image of her in its mind, it stuck. What allows me to read and retain? What are the forces and filters that make us like this and hate that? What makes us fall in love? When we first gathered artists and scientists together, Ed asked them what their ideal imagination institute would be. No one directly answered the question, but we had no problem with adherents. Antonio Damasio, Joe Nakachella, Laurie Anderson, Sharon Olds, Elaine Pagels, Jonathan Lear, Len Schengold, Marcel Kinsborn, Jason Brown were all part of these early exercises in self-definition, and many became part of our permanent advisory board. Along the way, we successfully formed partnerships with the National Academy Museum and Film Forum, the latter turning into a regular film series in which we previewed such movies as In the Realms of the Unreal, Rider of O, and Ballet Russe. We also funded our first project, a study of intuition and education conducted by Oliver Turnbull of the University of Wales, some results of which will incidentally be presented in the course of the weekend. Our initial conversations took place in Ed Nersessian's living room, and we hope that the intimacy of our new space with its round table setting will stimulate you as an audience to become active participants in this endeavor. From Ed's first question, what would your ideal imagination institute be, to tonight's topic, what is imagination, might not seem like progress. If contemplating imagination is a little like 15th century explorers setting out to discover a new world, we've barely made it out of the shipyard. But it reminds me of what the Nobel laureate and cell biologist Christian de Derve said at one of our recent panels. Evolution isn't a theory, it's a fact. Imagination isn't a theory, it's a fact. It has to be progress when you're ready to hit the nail on the head. Before we begin tonight's program, thanks are in order. I have already mentioned Ed Nersessian, the co-director of the Philoctetes Center, who has taught me so much and whose vibrant ideas and astonishing work ethic have infused all our projects. I have had two great collaborations in my life. One with my downstairs neighbor, Claudia Mayer, on the repair of her ceiling, which is my floor. And this one with Ed Nersessian. Seriously, Ed has been fearless, he's been tenacious, and inspired in the prosecution of his ideas, and returns emails almost as quickly as I do. I also want to thank Ellen Furtick, our programming director, Matthew Von Unworth, our media coordinator, and our other staff members, Adam Ludwig, Tristan Perrick, Jeb Knight, and Sam Soger. We congratulate Matthew Von Unworth on the recent publication of his book, Freud's Requiem. Lastly, I would like to thank Mary Llewellyn, who's Mrs. Edward Nersessian, for her constant input on all our projects and for her graciousness, patience, and insights. I would also like to thank my wife, Hallie Cohn, for her inspiration, support, and loving criticism. Hallie has always edited me, and I know she would have expunged these very lines if she had seen them. Rest assured, without Hallie's editorial comments, tonight's address would have dragged on even further than it already has. I would also like to remind audience members to turn their cell phones off. And so now I finally give you Ed Nersessian, who will introduce tonight's panelists.
The participants to the round table tonight are Marcia Cavell, who is a philosopher and a psychoanalyst and teaches at the University of California, Berkeley, or taught at the University of California, Berkeley. And her latest book, which will be available in 2006, is Reflections on Philosophy and Psychoanalysis. Harry, go ahead.
It's called Becoming a Subject.
Becoming a Subject. Harry Eyres is a journalist, a poet, a teacher, a theater critic, and in my book also very important because he's a wine writer. He writes a column for the Financial Times Weekend, and it's the column that kind of sets me straight every weekend and makes me go away from my work and relax. Rocco Landesman is a theatrical producer, very successful one. He's produced The Producers, Proof, and he's also an operator of Broadway theaters, owns and operates Broadway theaters, and has written essays for the New York Times. Rick Moody is a novelist and an author, and I'm sure you all know his books, The Ice Storm, Demonology, Purple America. Ned Rorem is an internationally known composer, Pulitzer Prize winner, renowned diarist and essayist on music, and he's, I believe, authored 14 books. C.K. Williams is a Pulitzer-winning poet and has won numerous awards aside from the Pulitzer, and he teaches writing at the program at Princeton University. The way I moderate these meetings is that I essentially do what Hallie Cohn calls non-moderating moderating, which means I don't do anything, but I try to encourage the participants to get into a kind of spontaneous conversation as if they were sitting in my living room and having had a couple of glasses of wine, were relaxed and were talking about the subject, which I realize is not a very easy subject. But with that, I'll open it.
I could open with something to do with the place we're in. A poet opens with a poem. It's not my poem, it's a poem by W.H. Auden. And when I was thinking of what the artistic imagination is, this occurred to me, especially given the place. He wrote a poem called In Memory of Sigmund Freud, right after Freud died. And basically what he did was poeticize Freud's ideas, make them imaginative. Freud was already imaginative enough. And what he did was recast the ideas in what we would call a poetical way, in a poetically imaginative way. So I'll just read the first three stanzas, which are really his presentation of the theory of repression, which is, one might say, is really at the base of most of Freud's insights. He wasn't clever at all. He merely told the unhappy present to recite the past like a poetry lesson, till sooner or later it faltered at the line where long ago the accusations had begun, and suddenly knew by whom it had been judged, how rich life had been and how silly, and was life forgiven and more humble, able to approach the future as a friend without a wardrobe of excuses, without a set mask of rectitude or an embarrassing overfamiliar gesture. Do you think that that's an adequate presentation?
I think that's terrific, yes. I haven't read it in a long while. I was surprised to hear it.
But I was thinking, I'd been thinking a little bit when I was, this subject, what is imagination, I found somewhat daunting, because it almost seemed too big to take on. And I found it slightly easier to think what wasn't imagination, or what came into my mind was the image of an unimaginative person. And there are a lot of those around, I think, and a lot of them, unfortunately, in high places. And
maybe some in this room, even.
I'm sure we can all be in like that. But I was thinking this...
On your left-hand side.
This person could be a government spokesman, certainly in my country, who would be talking about targets and objectives and national curricula, and or it could be a kind of person who was invading another country without thinking what they were doing, or without being sensitive to the culture of that country, allowing the museums of that country to be ransacked with all the images for thousands of years. So I think the unimaginative is rather with us. So I find that a little bit easier than thinking about the imaginative. But I was also thinking that in our culture there seems to be this endless opposition between imagination and reason, and somehow they've been opposed for a very long time. And I was trying to think of some way of escaping from that opposition. But I think Freud is an interesting example, because I feel Freud, although I like that very much, but in some ways Freud talks about the reality. I feel Freud is ambivalent about imagination. And although his psychoanalysis is a way of releasing the imagination, in some ways his ideas about reality can be quite repressive in themselves.
I don't know about any of that.
You mean any of the stuff about Freud, or any of it at all?
Any of what you just said. I want to come back to your lines from the Freud, the Autumn poem, about the future and the past, and to your comment that often we oppose imagination to reason. And one of the things I've been thinking about is that imagination is absolutely central to what we call thinking and to reasoning. And without it, there isn't any sense of either the future or the past. And without that, there's no sense of temporality as temporality, which seems to me absolutely the essence of the human mind. So I find the imagination all over the place, and I think we're always engaging in acts of it. And then I was asking myself, if I had to assign the imagination to the reality principle or the pleasure principle, I think I'd give it to the reality principle, because it seems to me that it's not an act of imagination unless at the same time you also know what is the case by your own lights. That is, I don't think of dreaming, for example, as an act of imagination, because in the dream I don't think of dreams as acts of imagination, because you're caught by the dream. When you're imagining, call it imagination if you like, but then I want to use another word, or imagination too, for another sense of imagination. It's only imagination when you see the cloud as a cloud, but you're also able to see it as something else. And that kind of activity we engage in all the time. And I think it requires, as I said, an awareness of what's really going on. And I don't think Freud was ambivalent about the imagination. I thought it was essential. I think he thought it was essential to thinking as well.
Nobody... I hate excuses, and I haven't been able to bone up on this. I've been feeling lousy for the past week. But this morning, or this afternoon, because I didn't get up until 12, I made a few notes, the first of which was about Philoctetes. I'm not pronouncing it the way you did.
I say Philoctetes,
But I had Philoctetes because I never knew who he was, but when friends of mine are about to have a baby, what am I going to call my baby? If I call him John, I always said, why not call him Philoctetes? And then I looked him up in the dictionary, and couldn't quite figure out who he was in relation to the Trojan War, and therefore why this organization is called Philoctetes. And also, I'm not quite sure what imagination is. I think, for example, the dreams that we were talking about, we create our own dreams. Nobody does it for us, and we create it out of our imagination, which has yet to be defined. But everyone's got imagination. You either got it good or you ain't. It's like the phrase creativity, which gets thrown around we have to teach our children to be creative. I don't know what creative means.
nobody likes to talk about art as hard work. They like to hear about inspiration. They like to hear about. I had to do a long interview on the telephone about an opera I've just written by somebody yesterday I'd never met, who said, "When did you first get that feeling of electric excitement over this work?" Well, I never had that feeling. I'm a professional composer, and I write music, and it's either good or it's not. But it's expert, but I don't know if it can come to life, and nobody can. Radiguet, the French poet, said, to be original is not, anyone can be original. A real artist steals. A second-rate artist borrows. A real artist knows that he is stealing, and therefore he tries to cover his tracks. The act of covering his tracks is the act of creation. A second-rate artist doesn't know he's covering his tracks, and you can see right through it. I don't want to go on too much about this, but I'm not a sentimental person, and I think that hard work is the most important thing for an artist. And as for psychoanalysis, I was psychoanalyzed. I was, as a kid, everyone said, Paul Goodman, who, for example, if Ned doesn't go to a psychoanalyst, we aren't going to talk to him anymore because we're sick of his being drunk all the time. And I went to a man named Dr. Eric Kraft, who was a pupil of Freud's. So that shows how old I am. And then finally, after a year, I said to him, "I'm going to Europe." And he said, "No, you're only going to take your dreary self with you." And I said, "No, I'm not." And I didn't. I'll pass this on to you.
Good for you.
Why?
Because I don't want to talk anymore.
I think it should be.
I wonder if we could actually think of examples of imagination, because I'm not sure that there really is even such a thing, or a particular kind of activity to which we refer when we use this word. Do we think of it in terms of ideas, in terms of art? It is an aesthetic function. I was glad to hear C.K. Williams read something. So if you'll forgive me just for a second, I'd like to read something from Santayana, whom Marcia probably doesn't consider a real philosopher, but is nonetheless an interesting thinker. He said, "The truth is that the group of activities we call aesthetic is a motley one, created by certain historic and literary accidents. Whenever consciousness becomes at all imaginative, or whenever a work, for whatever purpose constructed, happens to have notable intrinsic values for perception, we utter the word aesthetic. But these occasions are miscellaneous, and there's no single agency in nature, no specific organ in sense, no separate task in spirit to which the aesthetic quality can be attributed." And I guess what he's saying is that there's no particular thing that can easily be shown as a sufficient and really vivid example of what the aesthetic or imaginative process is. And I would like to throw out to the group here, what would be an example of imagination that we would readily identify as defining?
Couldn't one say, though, that imagination is taking place in every one of us every second of our lives?
Well, that doesn't really have any meaning.
I don't know what the next word I'm going to say is, but in my imagination it's already there, and so I'm forming a sentence now as I talk to you without even stopping. Imagination can be anything, and I think a definition has to be a lot more restrictive than that before I talk about it. It is near where I live in Central Park. There's a thing that says "Imagine," which Yoko Ono put up for her dead husband, which I think is nice. But imagine what? and it,
Yes, what is
it implies it's something poetic, but it's not necessarily poetic.
Okay, I'll throw out a definition just because it's the only thought I had on the entire subject. I have virtually no thoughts, and I'm by far the dumbest person here. However, as I was trying to think of anything that I could say in the course of the last week, I did come upon a couple of short analogs for what I imagine takes place when I myself am being imaginative. And I would propose two phrases: intellectual recombination and conceptual fluidity.
That sounds smart.
Say that again, Rick.
Intellectual recombination and conceptual fluidity.
Recombination of what?
Whatever.
Conceptual fluidity. I'm dumber than you are.
But is there I know I'm not a philosopher, and I was roundly taken to task, but I would still like to come back to, it does seem to me that there has been a tendency in Western thought for a very long time, since Plato, to make a distinction between thinking in concepts and thinking in images, between logos and mythos. And I think that Plato actually is very inconsistent in that. But that has been there, and people do tend to think there's a bit of a difference between conceptual thinking and imagistic thinking. I don't think it's a watertight distinction, but it is. I do think if one completely dissolves that, then that it does make. Well, that there is an intellectual history behind that. But when Plato wrote the Republic, and this seemed to me a great imaginative feat, and this is about imagining a whole new kind of society, and but at the same time he's a great sort of adherent of reason. But when he came to his most sort of profound thoughts, or Socrates, who actually is the main speaker in the Republic, he actually produces images, particularly the image of the cave, which So I think it's very ambiguous. It's a sort of ambiguous thing, but there has been a big sort of opposition between reason and imagination. I don't think we can deny it.
Well,
there have also been people who've destroyed images. There have been the Puritans who set about actually destroying all the images. In Britain, 95% of all the religious art was destroyed by Puritans, who then came and founded this country. So we can't say. So we can't. There's some history here. There's some anti-imagination history here. Let's not forget it.
Well, one of the things you're pointing to, I think, is it's a very ambiguous word. There are many, many meanings, and one is the capacity to form visual images. And that's what you're thinking of. But if you think of imagination in a broader sense that I was trying to get at, and that I want to come back to in commenting on your remarks, Rocco, as conceptualizing requires imagining. So let me now just say that I'd add one more essential condition to yours, and that is that imagining is being able to think of what is not.
You say
Without
visual.
that, I don't think there is imagination.
You say visual images, but it could also be auditory.
Of course.
One of the most, Eric Satie, who to me is one of the great composers of all time, and not just writing giddy music, he wrote a piece called Socrate, or Socrates, which is 3 dialogues of Plato to music, and whenever I play it to myself, I burst into tears. And it's an auditory rather than a visual. There's also an old pop song called Imagination. Does anybody remember that?
Yes, I've been singing it to
Imagination
myself.
is funny. It makes the bee think of honey,
Right.
the way I think of you, something like that. So it's it makes a sour day sunny. It makes a bee sunny day sunny.
There was an article in the New York Times science section this week on the front of it, which I brought just in case.
Mirror neurons?
About mirror neurons, in which they have found that we have these cells that actually are the basis of imagination, that it is this actual physical thing happens. The example they gave was of a monkey who sees someone eating something, and someone didn't turn that on. And in his mental apparatus, the same response happens as though he were eating an ice cream, eating something himself. And I thought that really is the basis of what anything mentally we would call imagination.
Do all
this
other
thing.
animals, non-mammals, have this?
Well, humans have it, which is most
But
important for
monkeys,
us.
as you mentioned. But
Well,
does-
I began to think about it. I was in Africa this fall, and I was on the savannah, and I was thinking I've always been fascinated by Australopithecus, which is our oldest ancestor, and this was where it's supposed to have evolved, if you believe in evolution. And I began to think, what must it have been like for him or her to be here and, be looking through the grass and the bushes. And I tried and I couldn't really make it real for myself. But I realized just what you said, when I began to think of this, that any animal who thinks there's something around that corner and I'm not going that way has done this thing of making a reality that wasn't there before. It's a very, very primitive, we would call it, reality. And I wouldn't necessarily use the term imagination, but it would seem as though if we go to the fundamentals, that it begins somewhere there.
That's as good at midnight or 4 in the morning, sometimes I go in my kitchen and there's a roach as big as that. And I hate to step on it because he or she, his family is behind the sink. They're all going to starve to death. And his little heart is beating. And so I just turn the light out and go back to bed.
Anyway, I was going to... I was going to leave the insect world. But anyway, I was going to get that it seems to me that...
you have to have the insect
if we
world.
use... Pardon?
I think you have to have anything that's alive, just to stay alive, means you've got to have some imagination.
Yeah, we have to have some mechanism that allows us to see what's not there. Let's put it that way.
And I don't think insects can do that.
Well, then what keeps them alive?
All kinds of things, animal instincts, but not imagination. But it depends, of course, on how you define it.
Yeah, I was going to say, so define imagination.
Well, I've been trying to. I've given a couple of conditions.
Marcia, follow up on what you said before.
Can I finish what I was saying?
Absolutely. Go ahead.
Anyway, when I started thinking about the different kinds of imagination and the fact that we have some artistic people here implies that there's something that we think of as the artistic imagination. And I realize when I look at art and judge, let's say, poetry, that what I'm really judging is the disinterestedness of the imagination. That the difference between this primitive thing that happens in which we can see what's not real and the thing that happens at the highest level, which I do think is art, is that somehow the self drops away, that it's not there anymore in the same way, and the art takes over. In the Auden poem, you can see that. It's a marvelous poem for that. It's a long, involved, very difficult poem about someone else and someone else's ideas. And he never mentions himself at all.
He also wrote a poem about a dictator who was a poet.
Mm-hmm.
If you know the Reflections on a Tyrant, I think it's called the State Lines.
Yeah.
Perfection of a sort was what he was after, is how it begins.
It seems to me it's easy to start thinking of imagination as something that's exclusive to art. Let me just give another example from another discipline, which seems to me a very good example of imagination at its highest. Galileo and then Newton, who, instead of asking the question that had been asked for hundreds of years, why do things move? And with that, you get the answer, finally, a prime mover, thought to ask, why does motion ever stop? And with that, you get a whole new universe. You get the laws of motion from Newton, and that seems to me an act of paramount imagination.
Freud.
That's one definition of it. I certainly wouldn't argue that, but I would say that when the term imaginative is usually described for a certain kind of thought, and
Well, I'm trying to broaden it.
Scientific is describe a different kind of thinking. They're not, of course, mutually exclusive, but those are the terms that our culture has sort of arrived at.
Why should they? Okay, why should they be different?
Just for handiness' sake.
What makes them different?
But I mean, would you say, give me an example of an artist who's scientific?
I'm giving you an example of imagination.
I know. I'm not trying to
Different kinds of
argue with you at all. I just said that the culture usually uses the term imaginative.
I don't want the culture's definition of it.
How about
Be more
another
imaginative.
term? How about the term invention, which I think, and not just in the sense of a scientific invention, but this was a word that was used a lot by musicians certainly in the 18th century. People like Haydn or Mozart would talk about invention, sort of things coming to them in a way. And I think that applies equally to scientists and artists. I mean, it's not the same word as imagination, but it's that you don't get that problem if you talk about invention.
They didn't think as much as we do about being original. They just wrote what the contemporary music of Haydn and Mozart's and Beethoven's time was the music that was played all the time. Today it isn't. The music that's played all the time today is rock music of one sort or another, and classical music is exclusively music of the past. 99% of it's Beethoven and Mozart. That's it. People like me were a negligible minority, and compared to rock music, we're just 1/10 of 1%. So they weren't thinking. I don't know what they were thinking, but it doesn't seem to me that I shall now write something different and new that's going to shock everybody, though, as John Cage may have said, or Boulez today.
But they did write things that were new, and that
it was new by definition.
They were quite dramatically new as well.
But you're hearing it with your 21st century ears.
I don't think entirely. I'm thinking about the way Haydn composed, which I don't think is that different from the way
people didn't get up and rush out of the hall the way they did up until about 20 years ago, and since then they don't even go to the hall.
Yeah, but I just mean the way, as a writer, as an artist, and not anyone necessarily terribly special, but there's this process by which things come to you, and I think that surely we, as a poet, I mean, the best things come to you. You don't will. I don't feel you don't will them. They come. And to you.
And you don't say, Rick. You don't say, I am now about to write something new that's going to shock people, or that's going to, or do you?
Actually, I really like what you were saying earlier about thinking of yourself as a professional and doing the job. And I mean, we've sort of danced around the role that intuition plays in imagination, and I guess that's sort of unquantifiable. But at least for me, that's part of the job of being a fiction writer that I take as imperative and unquestioned. And I don't try to make it scientific. You know, I just sit down and try to write my 1,500 words, and I think that intuitive muscle plays a huge role in it, but I don't know how exactly.
Do you play 1,500 in one sitting?
Yes.
It's a lot.
I wouldn't presume to speak for you, Rick, but I don't think, as a novelist, that the word invention would be the first word that would come to mind. You yourself said it. It might be something more on the order of reordering or synthesizing or putting in different relationships. It is such an exasperating and difficult problem as we try to sort out what exactly this process is, to what exactly it refers. Santayana in the same essay went on then to try to grapple with what it might be. And he went on to say that he felt the most important division in perception is that between what is found on the one hand and what is conceived or desired on the other. And I think as you actually try to then get through that or get your mind around that, it's not that simple at all, because it may be not an either or, but very much a combination of processes. It may be very much a re-rendering of what you already know. Not invention, but re-synthesizing. And that may be, at least from the point of view of a writer, what we're referring to as imagination.
Well, there's that famous thing, I know Stephen Dedalus talks about it in Ulysses. I think he does. Where it's suggested that it's impossible for an artist to make a character better than he or herself, and
that's what's known.
Yeah, exactly.
Right,
and yet,
that's right.
and yet, the idea of a Newton, an Isaac Newton, or a Tycho Brahe, or or Richard Feynman, I was thinking of a modern example to me of a physicist who was incredibly imaginative. You know, Feynman was all about metaphorizing things that we already knew, but the metaphors were so limpid and so stunning that to me they're just like art, actually.
But an artist, a great artist, can be a son of a bitch. They're or evil, the evil genius. Wagner was evil. He was a predecessor of the Nazis, and he was a great, great, great composer. And there are very saintly people who are mediocre. And as for the inventions, the Bach invention was not in the sense of thinking of something new so much as to there's no fugues in the Bach invention, but just an inventive way of putting the dominant after the tonic. When people say to me, when do you write, because you write 1,500 words a day, which I think is terrific. When people say to me, when do you write your music, I say, I'm never not writing it. It's in my head. The last thing is actually putting it on paper, but that's the end, and that's the least important.
All the time. I always say I have the worst slave driver for a boss. Me.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I actually want to ask Rocco a question, because as I was coming here, I was really trying to think in my mind, you know, obviously we're going to say that the artists are the great imaginers and so forth, but trying to think of non-artistic imagination in a way. And I want to ask you, in your role as an entrepreneur and a business person, in addition to being a theatrical executive and so forth, if you conceive of great thinking in the world of business as imaginative in the same way as in the arts.
There are certainly creative businessmen. There's no doubt about it. But it's usually in the form of having a certain, not so much of thinking of something new, but having a certain perception of reality that is is fresh or different. It's not necessarily having a brand new idea, but understanding what's in front of you better than someone else. It has to do. It may have as much to do with perception of reality as it does with thinking of new things, as it must in your work. What you're trying to find is some essential truth in a relationship or a situation. That's what you're doing, rather than trying to invent per se.
Which is for money.
What?
It's for money in business.
Well, it's for money when you write your opera too, and when I write my novel.
I'm not writing it for the money, really. If I were, I would not be in that business. As I just explained, nobody could care less. But if you build a better mousetrap, the world will beat a path to your door, and that's what business is. So it has to do with money.
But how does
a good businessman has a predictive talent, which has to do with I think a perception of the way things are and are going to be. I'd love to address that same question from the point of view of my own art, the art that I deal with every day, which is playwriting, which is theater. And I think that really touches on the very thing we're talking about, whether we're talking about something invented or something found. A playwright has always been considered, from the time of the Greeks, really a craftsman, a reporter. It's playwright, W-R-I-G-H-T, as in Smith-wright, not someone who is given an imaginative type title. And what does a playwright do? What he really does is report, or in a sense, record conversation. He observes people relating to each other and reports on that, and he fulfills a important role in what I think of as one of the most basic and fundamental of human activities, which is why I think playwriting is the most fundamental art, with all due respect to the composers, poets, and novelists here, because what we do, one of the most fundamental things we do as human beings is we gossip. We talk about other human beings. We observe their behavior and make judgments about them. We observe conversations among other people. We look at them talking, and we say, he's honest, and he's deceptive, and this person can be relied upon, and this person's intelligent, and this person is faithful, and this person is not. And we make all kinds of moral judgments on people based on our overhearing them, based on our observation of them. And what a playwright does is simply serve as a reporter in this process by presenting to audiences who then observe these conversations, overhear them as they're presented on the stage, and then talk about them. And now they happen to be directed with certain, perhaps, moral intention, but the audiences go, observe these conversations, and go home and gossip about them. Gossiping function is a fundamental and elemental human activity.
It's
and writers, playwrights, are reporters in this process. They're not inventors. They are simply observing the way people behave for the benefit of our being able to make moral judgments about them.
The Greeks, just half a second, they didn't say that the playwrights were reporters. They spoke of them having a daemon,
Being inspired, having a divine...
A genius, basically.
But by extension, all literature is gossip. Proust is nothing but gossip.
Hold on a minute.
Proust was the ultimate journalist.
And Balzac.
I think we're in danger
right.
of kind of shortchanging imagination here. I mean, look at Shakespeare, and I don't think Shakespeare's about gossip. And I'm thinking of a speech in A Midsummer Night's Dream, which I think is a wonderful imaginative play in itself. This is a speech by a man who does not believe in imagination, King Theseus. I don't know whether you remember this speech. And he says, the lunatic, the lover, and the poet are of imagination all compact. And he says, these are the sort of people who have wild imaginings, and they're either mad.
Gossip.
Well, it's not written in gossip; it's written in wonderful poetry. And but
there's a gossip function.
If you think about the poetic structure of the play as well, that this guy who does not believe in imagination is talking this way about imagination, but he hasn't seen the play. We've seen the play, and what we've seen in the play is an incredible feat of imagination. And we've seen, a man turn into a donkey, in the Queen of the Fairies falling in love with him. Theseus hasn't seen all that, so he dismisses it. At the same time, we're actually watching a play. He's a character in a play. He's been invented by someone. To me, this is an example of poetic, dramatic imagination that goes way beyond gossip. And not to speak of Aeschylus, which I think has nothing to do with gossip. So I feel I don't want to shortchange imagination. And can I just, people have read something, can I just read some things that Coleridge said about imagination? I thought he'd have to come in somewhere. And so this is a great spokesman of the romantic imagination. Okay, we're getting away from it, we're trying to, I quite understand, we want to not, this is in a way what everyone, Rick, I quite understand, this is sort of, what in a way we're reacting against. But what Coleridge said was, the primary imagination I hold to be the living power and prime agent of all human perception, and as a repetition in the finite mind of the eternal act of creation in the infinite I am. And I don't think he was talking about gossip.
Can you repeat it, say it again?
The primary imagination I hold to be the living power and prime agent of all human perception, which is rather what I think Marcia is saying, and as a repetition in the finite mind of the eternal act of creation in the infinite I am. So he's saying it's a divine thing.
I'd like to come back to something that you said, Ned. You spoke of the businessman as motivated by money, as if that meant it couldn't be imagination. But I don't see why the motive affects it. You can be imaginative in the pursuit of power, or evil, or money, or beauty. The motive is irrelevant, it seems to me. Perhaps some motives, if they're really constraining, psychologically constraining, are less fertile in the way that they give rise to
People are always
imagination.
asking me, how do you make any money? As though money were the ultimate aim. Also, I don't think music could be construed to be gossip.
No.
But nobody knows.
that. Yeah.
Music doesn't have any meaning. Or as Mendelssohn said, it's not that music is too vague for words, it's too precise for words. And when people when composers, when non-vocal music, a song means whatever the words tell you it means. And when people, even when people are writing up the Beatles, for example, what terrific music! Listen to those words. They never talk about the music, and yet the music is what the substance of it is. If non-vocal music, if Debussy decides to call La Mer, 3 scenes not on the ocean but in Paris, the dawn in Les Halles, noon in a whorehouse, evening at the floor, the listener will hear exactly what he's told in words to hear. And music can be made to mean anything because it doesn't mean anything in real life. Intellectually, it doesn't. And Freud's, to me, best writings were on Leonardo. He did a book on Leonardo.
Well,
know,
music
I
is the
would-
one art that doesn't have a representational aspect to it. Every other art has, in one form or another. Has
Yeah, which is why music can be conjoined with literature, and also, as we were talking about earlier, that different artists the arts don't necessarily overlap. I was talking to him about Elizabeth Bishop and her reaction to a poem of hers that I set, and her reaction was, a lot of great poets couldn't care less about music, and it goes in one ear and out the other. They don't know what it's about. And painters can be pretty thick-skulled sometimes. The greatest painters in the world.
I'd like to add, there's two sort of paths I'd like to take. The first one is that we're sort of defining imagination as anything clever that the human mind can do. Let me finish.
But we're not.
No one's interrupting you.
And as an artist, for me, the imagination, the artistic imagination, I'll leave it with that, has to do with form. It has to do with the struggle with form, whether it's form of novel, form of music, form of poetry, that there are these things, that's the strangest thing in human existence, perhaps, that there are these necessities that have nothing to do with anything that people put on an activity of the mind, such as, let's say, Shakespeare's iambic pentameter. There's absolutely no reason why anyone should speak in iambic pentameter. There's no reason why anyone should write a sonnet, but something happens in the exchange between consciousness and disinterested form, let's call it, that makes an intensification of experience that doesn't really happen anywhere else.
But people who speak English speak in iambic, the way the French speak in trimeter.
You get what I mean? They don't speak in sonnets, and the sonnet is a great intensification.
No, but they do speak in iambic pentameter.
The other thing that I was going to go at, since I have the floor and it's hard to get, I'll keep it for a minute. Is the imaginative experiencing of art and of other products of the imagination, and how do people who experience things experience it imaginatively? I was thinking about what you said about government, and I realized that one of the functions of government, especially at a time like ours, is the repression of the imagination of the people. It's to keep people from imagining things too much, because if you start imagining people in a war, for instance, the 30,000, as he put it, or so, if you start imagining what happened to each of their bodies and what happened to each of their minds, it would be very disruptive. And then the other thing that's interesting, is, again, in our time, is religion. And what is the place that imagination has in religion? What happens when people, if you're not religious, you can't experience the religious imagination except as the most artificial thing. But people do experience religion in this incredibly global, engulfing way. And it's just something I've been very interested in thinking about. How does those two things, there's one that's, and it's happening, we have happening at the same time, the repression of the imagination politically, and then the elevation of a certain kind of restrictive imagination in religion.
Do you approve of the religious imagination?
I was thinking, it came to me, there's this thing that I think St. John says, I'm not a great Bible person, that there's faith, hope, and charity. These three things abide. But the greatest, or love. What?
St. Paul.
St. Paul. But the greatest of these is charity, or love. And I always thought, why does he say it's the greatest? Faith and hope. Faith seems to be the basis of religion. Hope seems to be what it promises. Why is charity the greatest? And I realized that charity is the one that requires the most imagination. It's the one that requires you to think about other
love,
people.
which was wrong.
Exactly. It's caritas, right? In the original, it's caritas.
Can I just sort of add to what Sir Evans was saying, that Joseph Conrad talks about imaginative sympathy, which I feel is this is something that perhaps we should think about, is that imagination isn't just this mental ability we have or some ability to think in images or invent things, but it's also the way that we can actually understand that somebody else is a human being, like us, or not, as the case may be. And that's what Conrad talked about very movingly, I think, and sort of that's what I think he thought his novel writing was about, was actually getting into the, enabling a reader to understand another person as a human being. And this is what the religious person who thinks that he's going to heaven or whatever by blowing up, a lot of fellow citizens in the tube in London or whatever, it's got some kind of imagination, but it doesn't seem to be the right kind of imagination. So.
Well, it seems to me that, imagination is such a broad term, and having a group of creative people here, you're essentially mostly talking about a particular kind of imagination. In psychoanalytic terms, the most basic definition of imagination is to have a mental representation of something that's not there.
Well, isn't that... Yeah, but that's...
But once you're talking... So this is a different kind of imagination than some of the things we are talking about. And
Coleridge actually uses the term fancy or fantasy
right.
to distinguish that from just what we're talking about, that they're two different things.
I'm a Quaker, and I was raised a Quaker, but not in the religious sense, but in the pacifist sense. And I really hate religion. I think it's destructive and disgusting. But some of the very best music I've ever written has been on biblical texts from the Bible. So the fact of poetry and what the poetry says are two different things. I think that religion is, in a sense, is intrinsically evil.
Harry, I like bringing up the way in which...
That's a definite statement.
Yes, yeah. And I think that people who are entrenched in religion lack imagination, can't get out of it.
I was just going to say that I like your reference to empathy as an act of imagination. And again, it gets us out of just fastening on artistic imagination, which I think is one sort of imagination, but there are many others that we're neglecting.
Well, for example, a physicist, Werner Heisenberg had one of his assistants quit the physics lab, and he said, because he wanted to write fiction, and he said, for writing fiction he has enough imagination. His imagination will suffice.
Well, Wittgenstein, that kind of a mind is imaginative too, is in a non-poetic way.
May I finish what I was going
I'm
to say?
sorry.
At the end of The Tempest, you may remember Prospero, who was the imaginator par excellence, has abdicated his power, which, by the way, tends towards a kind of grandiose omnipotence, which is one of the hazards of imagination, I think. And Ariel is telling him about the sufferings of all the people that have been shipwrecked by Prospero's power. And the descriptions are horrendous. And Prospero says something like, "Were you moved?" And Ariel said, "I would were I human." And Prospero at that point is both shamed by Ariel's superior empathic imagination and also by the vividness of his description into feeling what I think we're supposed to feel for the first time is an understanding that other people really are other and also like himself. So I see that as sort of one of the ends that Shakespeare has us describing the imagination as functioning at.
Which happens to King Lear as well.
Which happens to King Lear as well.
He suddenly says, "I've taken too little care of this," and he suddenly thinks about the wretch and the which he wasn't able to do before. But that was through going mad, which is another question.
But we all have our own concept of the world, and when you die, your concept of the world is gone forever. And there are as many different worlds as there are people in this room, many different conceptions of the world.
There was another current events thing in the Times today. There was this judge who's in jail, and he's making a big thing of how, now I understand what jail is. The only way he could imagine it was to be in it. He couldn't think, my goodness, what's it like to have the door close on you for however many years. I found
but that implies that indicates the limits of imagination. You can't really imagine you
can.
were saying before about people.
No, he could imagine it. He's just stupid.
Yeah, he was lazy.
He couldn't. I don't think he could. I don't think you can imagine what you can then actually go ahead and feel.
I missed the details of the news item, but a man that wrote a book and was threatened with being put in prison.
He's a judge, and he had tried and sentenced many people, and then through a little malfeasance, was convicted of felony and went to a prison where there were any number of actual convicts who he had sent up himself. And the story opens with him being confronted by a guy.
His own book.
No, it's not a book. This is just a human interest story on page
No, we're
one.
talking about two different things.
No, we're talking about the same thing.
Are we?
Yeah.
Yeah, it was an article in the Times today.
I thought it was about a man who wrote a book, but
No, it's
Involved
about a man who's
so
judge.
far.
It's about a man who
It's
never
a
read
poor
a
judge
book.
who went to jail.
but he was a liar.
No, well, in any event, he went to jail, and he was then confronted by many, many convicts. And the story was all about, now he knows what it's like on the other side, and he should have thought twice before giving that one guy the 2 life sentences.
Yeah, and all the people who know him kept saying he doesn't really believe what he's saying. Did you notice that? That was very strange. Like they thought he still, even though he was there, he still couldn't imagine it.
Yeah.
When someone says, I never imagined, what they're really saying is, I didn't know. And I wonder, can one imagine what one doesn't know?
Yes,
Yes.
Saying
that's
yes.
what novelists do.
Well,
And
I'm
playwrights.
not sure that it's that clear. And to some extent, what you're doing as a writer is about what you do know, and maybe reordering what you perceive and what you
No,
see.
that's the
Well,
miracle of
I have a-
that's the miracle of art.
I
Is
have a-
that you don't. You
I mean,
write what
Kafka
you
wrote
don't know.
a story about a man being decapitated
Or turning into a cockroach or a bug.
turning into a roach.
I have a whole chapter in my new book that's what a woman's thinking as she comes out of a coma. And I've never been in a coma, and I don't know what it feels like, and yet there it is.
It seems to me also that imagination also precedes knowing. You imagine something and then you begin to know it, just as you imagine what it's like to be somebody else and then you begin to know it. Or you imagine what it's like to think of bodies moving in a different way, or to ask a different question about the relationship between mind and the world order, as Wittgenstein did from Descartes' question. And once you've begun that act of imagination, then you begin to explore and to know.
And then you write the book and then you forget it.
But, and it's kind of images come to you. I mean, this is something that seems to happen, isn't it? That certainly in poetry, sort of images come. You don't know them beforehand. You don't will them into being. They come, and that's not just poets. So all of us surely have. I mean, perhaps this relates to the psychoanalysis and the unconscious. That you can see the unconscious as a great seething mass of images.
Different poets do different things, though. A poet can find the word because it'll rhyme with another word, and suddenly the rhymes make an idea that he didn't know was there beforehand. Mm-hmm. It's an accident.
But I don't think it's ever like painting by numbers. I mean, I don't think any good poetry is like painting by numbers. I mean, I think one would be able to notice that if it was.
I would say come back to this idea of craftsmanship and professionalism. I don't agree with that at all. When something's happening to me with a poem, when I'm struggling with it and things are happening, it's a kind of mental experience that's really not like anything else. I don't know what people call inspiration, whatever, but I just know it's not like just doing a job or doing my job or writing prose.
Sung or set to music?
What?
Have you ever heard a poem of yours that's been set to music?
Yeah, a few times. I wasn't terribly happy about it.
Were you flattered at least?
That someone had set the poem? Yeah, sure, but that didn't have anything to do with
Because there's
the
something
creation of it.
illegitimate about
I
writing
have
a
a
song.
question for you then. Since I totally disagree about this inspiration issue, what I'm curious is if that feeling that you're attributing to the sort of white heat of artistic creation has anything to do with the religious imagination you were talking about before.
That I don't know, because I don't have a religious imagination. I've never had a religious experience. I've tried. In one of my poems I used, somebody read the line back to me. I tried to pray a being who would pray. To pray myself to be a being who could pray. And I can't, so I don't know. I have no idea. I mean, they say, it has been said in the past that the mystics and the poets and everything had a similar thing. I have no idea whether mystics often seem to me rather psychotic.
What you're saying is that in the creative process, you come to know things you didn't know before. And I just wonder about that and whether that actually happens.
It's not knowing. It's again, it's
seeing,
the
or
struggle
seeing.
with form. It's when I talk to my student, it's like the musicalization of consciousness. It's like your mind becomes musicalized somehow, and it's not just knowing or not knowing. It's something that's not like anything else, and it's incredibly exalting and addicting. That's why artists are often sad. It's because this doesn't happen that often, and the rest of the time you're depressed.
Interesting.
It's not necessarily. I mean, I was thinking of another Yeats poem, and suddenly I saw the cold and rook delighting heaven. It begins, which is an incredible opening, and that's just because he suddenly saw something and it was there. But this suddenly came to him with the force of a. And it also is a terrifying poem because he thinks that he's being sent out for punishment. He thinks that souls will be sent out into the sky for punishment. But it's not something, that the day was there. It was a cold day in Galway. But suddenly that as an image and also as a line of poetry, because as C. Gordon says, of course, it's also a line of poetry. I mean, that isn't.
But it's like when we dream, we don't. It may be maybe a completely different kind of reality, maybe completely divorced from reality, but it's not something we don't already know.
I think it's not something we know.
You can
Of
only
course, we
get
don't
the
know
images
it.
that you have in your brain for a dream.
But you don't know
But
it.
that's
I mean,
different
you
from,
don't know. You don't know what's in a dream, and you can't predict what's in a dream. I totally disagree with the idea that we know what's in a dream. A dream.
No, the dream has the components of a dream are all known to us.
Yeah, because the objects that you use to create the visual image, they have to be objects that are known to you.
What about an architect who makes a building? Does he know it before he makes it?
Does he know it in his mind, in his
Does he know
mind's
it?
eye,
No,
or on the
but
paper?
does he know it? If you know everything that you use, then how do you?
Well, another
practical
example
thing.
would be mathematicians or physicists who discover things. Einstein, for instance, said he feels something in his body. He never has an idea in his head. He only writes it down later as an idea. It's just a sensation in his body.
But you can't be an architect and do that, or the building will cave in.
I can't just let this go about dreams because, I mean, obviously, I had a dream the other night in which this large hawk or eagle.
You have to be careful telling dreams.
You can psychoanalyze. I really don't.
Go ahead.
But go ahead.
I might object if you interpret it too drastically.
There's a big hawk?
I mean, I don't want a Melanie Klein type interpretation anyway.
Please
Anyway, a large bird, a hawk or eagle, just came. It was in the room, and it was almost as big as a person. I mean, you say I know. I mean, obviously it was something I recognised as a hawk, but I didn't. What I disagree with is that I knew that particular hawk because I'd never met it before. It was something that came to me that I'd never met. I'd never met a hawk. I've seen a lot of hawks, but I'd never met a hawk like this that had come into my room and was looking at me in this particular way. In that sense, I didn't know it. It was new.
Well, it's just condensation and displacement, right? Those are the words.
But what does that mean? Does that explain it
means
away?
you knew it, but you just didn't know it in that particular guise.
Forgive me for sounding like a philosopher, but this is an old question in philosophy, and the empiricists thought, and Descartes played with the idea before them, that every element in the dream is something you've experienced. But when you think about it, once you start asking what the elements are, it doesn't become a very interesting proposition,
Right.
you know.
I agree.
And the way in which you can recombine and synthesize and so on, it seems to be much more interesting than trying to locate what the particular elements are that you have in fact experienced.
Right. Any more than poetry is language and words that we already know.
Yeah.
Right.
But can I just quote Coleridge again on this? Because I think what Coleridge said about fancy, which he opposed to imagination, he said was different, was that fancy has no other counters to play with but fixities and definites. And I think that's what part of our discussion has been about. And some people have... And Coleridge didn't think that that was imagination. He thought that was fancy. And when he talks again about the worth and dignity of poetic imagination, that fixing unfixes, and while it melts and bedims the image, still leaves in the soul its living memory, which I think is in itself a wonderfully poetic description of something which is not exactly what we've been talking about all the time. And it's about a kind of image making that doesn't just deal with definites and things that we know, but actually reforms them. So that's just another view, another way of restating that.
I don't agree that all artists are sad, as you said. I think everyone is sad. Anyone who's got brains is sad just to live in this world. But I think the artists are the least sad of all people because they're the only people on earth who are doing what they want to do and are able to do it and are appreciated for doing it, because most people just want to make money or go to the movies or do this or that. But artists have an organization that allows them to express the sadness. So they may be sad because it's wrong not to be sad.
How about psychoanalysts and philosophers? Yes.
I said that we're sad on bad days when we're not being artists. We're just being.
There's a whole school of thought that they're artists because they're sad.
Are people still being psychoanalyzed?
I want to go on record, just because the romantic area of the room is over here, as saying that I don't actually think as an artist that what I do is significantly different from designing automobiles.
I didn't say. I agree with that.
Yeah.
See, that's the difference between novels and poems.
Whoa. M's fighting word.
I just want to tell you a brief story. Whether it makes sense or not, I don't know. But there is a paper written by a psychoanalyst on the psychology of imagination, which was written back in the 50s, and he does a very careful description of what he considers to be imagination, and relies on clinical data, and he relies on the work done by Piaget in terms of at which point in the development of a child can the child maintain in his mind an image of something that is no longer there. And he was a great admirer of Coleridge, so he also discusses fancy versus imagination and so on. And it's a very nice paper, I think, is the paper that Francis was referring to. Another analyst hears the paper and quips that he left the image out of imagination. Thank you very much.